Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, Senior Editor at Forbes. Right now, there are some 20 lawsuits against prediction markets like Kalshi and Polymarket that have been brought by individual states. But the Trump administration appears to be throwing its support not behind the states, but behind the prediction markets. Joining us to discuss what is going on here is Kevin Frankel. He is a partner and chair of the Attorneys General practice at Benesch. He has a lot of experience with state government and was a former New York Assistant Attorney General. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Maggie. Thanks for having me.
So, there's a lot of moving parts to what is going on here. Over the past few months, we've seen several states file suit against these prediction markets. And then last week, we have the chairman of the CFTC writing in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in support of companies like Polymarket and Kalshi. Can you give us your overview of where we are and how we got here?
Sure. And Maggie, there's a lot to unpack there, so I'll take it a piece at a time, perhaps. But starting maybe with the new chair of the CFTC. So Michael Selig was confirmed by the Senate December 18th and sworn in on December 22nd, 2025. And in his confirmation hearings, he was asked about the predictive markets issues. And his position was basically the CFTC was going to sit on the sidelines and wait for the courts to decide the issue, and then they would proceed accordingly. But they weren't going to get involved. What happened recently is the CFTC filed an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief. They're not a party. In the Ninth Circuit appeal from the Nevada litigation involving Kalshi. And without getting too into the weeds on who was asking for preliminary injunctions and all the rest of it, suffice it to say, Nevada has taken the position that the sort of predictive markets that Kalshi and Crypto.com and Polymarket and a lot of these folks are operating, to the extent that they are placing event contracts on the outcomes of sporting events or what may happen inside a sporting event, that's gambling on sports, which is covered by state law. You have to be licensed, you have to be over 21, etc. And so they're trying to shut down these online businesses, and either exclude them from the state or force them to get licensed. So that case went up to the Ninth Circuit. The CFTC put in an amicus brief taking a position, which again, CFTC Chair Selig had said they really weren't planning on doing. The CFTC said, we believe that this entire field is preempted by federal law. And so the states have no ability to regulate here. It's exclusively a federal jurisdiction. It falls within the Commodities Exchange Act, which is the law that the CFTC operates under. And interestingly, it didn't take very long for the Ninth Circuit to reject that argument and send the case back down to Nevada for further litigation. So there's an interesting political pull there, and we can talk some about that. But the folks in Congress, at least on the left side of the aisle, have not been thrilled about this change in position at the CFTC. They had asked the CFTC to stay out of it. And they've actually noted that having event contracts that have to do with certain areas, including gaming, so the areas are sports gaming, war, terrorism, assassination, those should be barred and not listed, traded, or cleared under the CEA. And Congress has made clear that those sorts of activities are contrary to the public interest. So basically, you've got 22 senators who are sort of taking that position. You've got the CFTC who sort of ignored them and waded into this. And then you've got a flurry of litigation. I think we're up to 30 cases now, maybe, across states like New Jersey and Maryland and Nevada and Massachusetts and Tennessee and Connecticut, Ohio. I mean, we're all over the place now. Um, and we have circuit splits that have come up. For example, Maryland ruled against Kalshi and predictive markets, and that's up now to the Fourth Circuit. Um, Tennessee put a preliminary injunction in place in favor of Kalshi, and it seems like it's going the other way. And I think the global takeaway here is going to be there's going to be general chaos until we have finality on who controls the regulation here. Is it the states? Is it the federal government? And it's going to take the Supreme Court to sort that out. And for those who don't follow these things, it's probably going to take another couple of years before we wind our way through the appellate courts to get to Supreme.
So the matter of who regulates these prediction markets like Kalshi and Polymarket will be something that the Supreme Court decides eventually. But until then, I want to go back, and maybe this is a basic question, but I think a lot of our viewers and readers know and understand Kalshi from not just sports betting, but also betting on election outcomes, or I think in the case of the Grammys or the big award ceremonies, you can probably bet on certain outcomes for what will happen with Best Actor or Album of the Year, which makes this complicated, right? Because some of what these sites do is allow you to bet on sports. So if a state is arguing we regulate sports gambling, they have a case there. But because these businesses are, I would say, diversified across predictive events, is that a fair argument?
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think there is a difference between betting on the outcome of elections. Predicted does a lot of that, versus sports betting or betting on, and I'll call it betting, but on the outcome of a futures contract, like what are soybean futures going to look like, pork bellies, which traditionally have been traded on the Commodities Future Exchange in Chicago. I mean, that's sort of the traditional jurisdiction of the CFTC. So where it gets murky is we've got the Kalshis, the poly markets, on one hand that are sort of primarily in this predictive market space, event contracts. On the other side, you've got DraftKings, you've got FanDuel, Fanatics, folks who are traditionally in sports betting and are licensed in states to do that. Um, but there's sort of this pressure of Kalshi's already gobbled up a lot of the market. If folks don't get into this space, they're going to be boxed out. So you see like DraftKings predictions or FanDuel predicts, they've got their own predictive market products to kind of hedge their bets. So everyone is kind of getting into everything and waiting for the courts to tell them what is and isn't okay. But in terms of who's going to regulate it, it's going to come down to what's one of the more complex issues in state AG practice, frankly. What is the jurisdiction of the federal government and what is the purview of the states? Ultimately, it comes down to sort of the supremacy clause. Generally, the federal government takes precedence over the states. But when it comes to these specific preemption issues, there's kind of three different kinds of preemption. There's field preemption, and that's what Kalshi argues applies here, and I'd say the CFTC agrees at this point. That's where the federal government occupies the field. They're the sole regulator in a space, and the states can't touch it. Um, so there's also conflict preemption, and the courts are exploring this in the Kalshi context as well. That's where you have a specific state regulation that's really impossible to enforce without encroaching on a specific federal regulation. So it's a more specific issue rather than the entire field is preempted. The states can't even regulate there. And then finally, there's express preemption, which is where you have written into the federal law that it intentionally preempts the state law. Um, the Commodities Exchange Act doesn't do that, so express preemption isn't a serious issue for the predictive markets litigation right now. But we've got different courts going different ways on the field and conflict preemption, and the circuit split, and that's what's all brewing at the moment.
And that's part of why you think it will be at least 2 years before this gets to the Supreme Court?
Right. And in the meantime, the problem is we have different things going on in different states. So you could end up with, um, Kalshi allowed to, and I'm picking on Kalshi, but of course it's all of these types of businesses able to essentially engage in, doing an event contract on the winner of the World Series or the Super Bowl or how many baskets are going to be made in a game. They could do that in Tennessee, but potentially not in Nevada. And one of the arguments that Kalshi has raised is that it's a national platform and they don't have a great way to geofence this. Um, and figure out whether one of their users who maybe is based in Tennessee is actually sitting in Nevada when they place a bet and who's on the other side of that bet. And it gets very complicated. So Kalshi is hoping that with CFTC regulation, they have one set of rules for all 50 states. And the alternative is if you have the patchwork of state gambling regulations, not all states allow gambling at all. And the ones that do, you need to get a state-specific license and comply with all the rules. And it's things like generally you have to be 21, not 18. Some of the users on predictive markets are in that 18 to 21-year-old range, which is a hot market for some of these items. So there's a lot of complication here if it ends up going to the patchwork model.
You know, Kevin, one of the things that's most interesting to me came in Michael Selig's op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and he wrote, quote, "The CFTC will no longer sit idly by while overzealous state governments undermine the agency's exclusive jurisdiction over these markets by seeking to establish statewide prohibitions on these exciting products." And this case is interesting because you have the particulars of sport gambling versus event contracts and futures contracts. But is this ultimately a proxy battle between states and the federal government as to who has more control over policy right now?
There's an element of that to it. I mean, I think a lot of the political flame throwing comes from the 180 between um, what the CFTC chair said in confirmation hearings versus that position that he put in the Wall Street Journal. And also in the amicus brief, and I can quote from that in the Ninth Circuit, because the CFTC talks about Dodd-Frank giving the CFTC exclusive jurisdiction, and goes on to say Congress did not limit covered swaps to binary outcomes. Instead, it expressly encompassed contracts measured by the extent of the occurrence of an event. This broad language encompasses contracts based on the margin of victory or any other quantifiable result of a sports event. So the problem you got is you've got sports betting and you've got events contracts. And if you draw the Venn diagram, there's a tremendous amount of overlap where basically everything that's a sports bet could also be considered an events contract. Now, soybean futures, outcomes of elections, it doesn't go the other way. Those wouldn't be sports betting. They're, other kinds of betting or investment or use your terminology. But if the CFTC is right about this, you could sort of see them potentially wiping out sports betting entirely. Um, and I think the states look at this and say, we're making a bunch of money for education, for general fund, for wherever these licensing fees and taxes are going, um, to the state coffers. If the CFTC says we're out of this business, there's a financial impact there. Um, and then, of course, there's the other political issue here of some of these events contracts have been on things like, um, is Venezuelan President Maduro going to be removed from office? And there has been chatter about folks in the federal administration participating in these event contracts starts to look a lot like insider trading situations, and so there's questions about should that be allowed, and uh what is the motivation behind the federal intervention in this issue, and how much uh, personal profit margin is on the line for some of the folks making the decisions.
That's a really good question. And I want to go back to the money question that you mentioned for the states. The states make billions of dollars off of sports betting right now. Is that correct?
Yeah, I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but I think it's fair to say. And on the flip side, with prediction markets, I think there were over a billion, billion and a half, I think maybe it was 1.6 billion, um, in event contracts placed just on the Super Bowl. So forget, a year's worth of these, but just one sports event.
So there are policy and governing implications, there are financial implications. The other thing I wanted to ask you about also comes from an argument made by the FTC chairman Selig. He said in his op-ed that the public benefits from these markets, and he pointed to folks who were following the 2024 presidential election, and if you had been following these, you wouldn't have been surprised that President Trump ultimately won. How much will the public benefit argument come into play in future legal arguments here? Because as it relates to sports betting, there are, of course, warning after warning after warning that you see on these sites in commercials on TV about gambling addiction. So, how does that argument strike you?
Yeah, and one of the things the states have been saying is we have a strong interest, a state police power interest in regulating state gambling, and we want to make sure that people with gambling addiction are getting help and treatment and don't have access to these products. Um, it's a lot easier to keep somebody out of a physical casino than it is to keep them off their phone. So that's going to be a struggle on these, but it's a struggle for the FanDuels and DraftKings of the world also. It's not just a Polymarket, Kalshi, Crypto.com issue. And we could have a whole nother conversation about crypto and those sorts of investments. Yeah, and I think the other part of this that um, the CFTC and Congress may come to loggerheads is at least some members of Congress believe that it is not in the public interest. It is um, against public policy for the CFTC to um, approve event contracts, predictive market contracts that approximate sports betting. Um, Now, you could imagine a really interesting outcome here where the CFTC does get exclusive jurisdiction. The states can't regulate the call sheets or the poly markets or the predicts. But then the CFTC comes in and says, if it looks like a sports bet, it's out. We're not going to approve these. And thus far, this is getting in the weeds again, but the system for folks to have compliant products with the CFTC is self-certification. Basically, a call sheet would go and say, we're putting out this event contract and we self-certify that it's in compliance with the CEA. And the CFTC generally takes companies' words for it. Um, if they were to, investigate, bring an enforcement action, decide that they're going to be more active in this space, could they start denying some of these contracts? They could, but where's the political will and how much of this is the executive branch of the government versus the legislative branch, and how much is the legislative branch united at any opinion on this? Those questions sort of remain to be seen. And so far we are not seeing, a huge bipartisan consensus on this issue in Congress.
A lot of questions remain, including this one. What does all of this mean for consumers? You mentioned that it could take 2 years for the Supreme Court to ultimately hear this case. So is it standard operating practice from now until then?
It's a great question, Maggie. And we're sort of at the mercy of the courts on this one. I think what you may end up seeing is these products are going to be widely available throughout the country. But will there be spot outages, let's say in Nevada or in Massachusetts or in Maryland, where Kalshi has to turn off the flow until an injunction is worked out or a settlement is reached or an appeal is resolved. We could start seeing that. And then we'll see, to the extent some of these companies are making the argument, we can't operate under a patchwork model. We can't turn out the lights on one state. We'll see if it's true. We'll see if they have to shut down the entire platform or if they can geofence. I would expect there will be some geofencing. There will be some patchworking that goes on at these companies. It's too lucrative a market just to turn off the off switch. But I think we're going to see some bumps in the road, and you know, potentially like pornography, another sort of regulated environment. You may see consumers where they're used to going to certain websites and then they cross a state line or get close enough to a state line that their internet browser thinks that they may have crossed, and it may say, sorry, you don't have access to this website anymore. You don't have access to your app anymore. Better luck next time. Go back to another jurisdiction where this is allowed. So that may lead to some consumer frustration. It may lead to some people missing out on event contracts or, you know, TBD what happens if somebody enters a contract, has the winning side of it, but by the time they win, they're sitting in a state where they're not allowed to collect on it. This is sort of uncharted territory for us.
Well, we will have you back to give us updates on this uncharted territory and the many questions that come with it. But in the meantime, Kevin Frankel, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insight on these prediction markets and what will happen in the courts.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks again, Maggie. We'll be in touch.